Hello friends and enemies, and welcome back to Nerdbot Generations on YouTube. Here we are once again in the lair, and today we're going to be doing a little bit of a double retro review, something a little special for you folks. But first off, we got to talk about all the goodness that you can find here. We got lots of retro reviews here on YouTube to check out, many things to see and be offered, as well as some build stuff that I did a little while ago, which I'm currently working on a little story to go with that. It's done, it just needs to be edited and tinkered with a little bit, but it's coming along, and that should be going up on the judsumstudios.org Bronx Division tab in a little bit here. But in the meantime, check us out here on YouTube. You can see all the stuff that we do, and you can check out a bunch of movie reviews for things that me and Steve have watched. Otherwise, check out our podcast, Nerdpod Generations, anywhere you find great pods. I like to go through Spotify, you can do Apple, we're on Anchor, we're on many services. So what we're going to do today is a retro review double feature. This is something that I did last weekend, and it was a bunch of fun. It was something I like staying up late and watching movies. It's one of my favorite things to do, especially on the weekends. There's nothing like starting a movie at 11 midnight and ending at 2 or 3 in the morning and just being like, I don't know, there's something special about the quiet hours of the morning for movie viewing for me. And so this is double fold when it comes to atmospheric movies. So what did I do? I did a double feature of A Quiet Place 1 and 2. Now, I had never seen A Quiet Place before. It came out in 2018 originally, to much acclaim and fanfare. I always heard about theaters being silent when watching A Quiet Place and how immersive that was. So I do kind of miss that experience, not having it. But watching it at 1 in the morning, it does have a very similar stillness to the world. There's just not a lot going on. And, there's just a lot of quiet to go with this very quiet movie. If you don't know, A Quiet Place stars John Krasinski, Mr. Fantastic, Emily Blunt, knock on wood, the Invisible Woman, Millicent Simmons, Noah Jupe, and that's really it. There's a few other very small players, but really it's just this very small family. And it's the story of this family in Anytown, USA, who experience the end of the world when a meteorite crashes into the earth and unleashes monsters. And these monsters have super adept hearing, so you can't make any noise. And they seem to not hunt so much as just kill widely. We'll get to it in a minute, but that was one thing that I noticed, and I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. But the monsters, they're not hunters, they're just killers. They just seem to kill for the sport of it, for the sake of being terrifying and scaring an audience. So it's not like, Jaws, where it's a monster shark hunting a group. It's just these monsters that just kill. That's their whole thing. So you have to be extremely quiet in order to avoid them. You can't make any noise at all. There's no talking. There's no loud noises of any kind, soft noises. The rules are a little hot and cold at times, and we'll get to that too. But overall, this is just a story. It's kind of a Die Hard type story where it's just this. It takes place on this farm. Everything really, there's a few ancillary moments outside the farm, but for the most part, it takes place on this farm. And it's the trials and tribulations of this family who have lost people like anybody else, but have lost people in their own unique and difficult way. So this is really the story of how they come together and how they continue to love each other, even in these horrifying circumstances. The family is really well done. Obviously, you have Krasinski and Emily Blunt at the top, and they're doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of establishing the world and making sure that we feel connected to everybody and everything that's going on, because the movie drops you in. I think the first thing that we see is a title card for day 89. It fast forwards like a year. I think it's like day 400 and something. And so it's over a year later. So you have this family dealing with these monsters, but also this tragedy within their family and kind of this new growth that's coming, and all the different tendrils that go into that. You do have Krasinski and Emily Blunt doing a lot of really great acting, especially given that they can't talk. They have to do a lot of acting with their faces. And Emily Blunt especially is extremely good at that. John Krasinski is playing kind of the reserved father who's just trying to keep his family together and keep them alive, and he's like the warrior dad. Whereas Emily Blunt is this very therapeutic mother who is there for her young children and supports them, and is also pregnant. And so you have the added challenge of having a baby brought into this situation, a baby which is a living noise machine being brought into this situation. So there's a lot of drama going on around all of this, and in the middle of it you have these two kids, Noah Jupe and Millicent Simmons. And I want to talk about Millicent Simmons particularly because she is great here. She is fantastic as I kept on calling them boy and girl. I know that's very Bird Box, but they didn't really talk names. They didn't give us names for the most part. So it wasn't until the second one that I was like, oh, that's what their names are? I remember it wasn't until I was reading the credits I was like, oh, her name is Reagan? Really? I don't think they said it once. So she plays Reagan, who is this deaf girl, the eldest of this family, who is trying to take care of her siblings and live through the apocalypse and deal with some terrible grief all at once. And she is so good in the role. She is so good, and she is by far the heart and soul of this movie. Emily Blunt does a lot of heavy lifting in terms of like danger and physical violence, whereas Millicent Simmons, she's the linchpin that holds the plot together, and at the end is the most important character to what's going on. She allows for a win, because if you haven't seen it, it is actually a really good movie. It's a really fantastic, really in-depth, it draws you right in, much better than something like Bird Box, which was something similar. You had to take away a sense, so in this case there's no talking, you can't be heard. In the case of Bird Box, you can't see. If we're comparing the two, I'd say that this is much more successful than Bird Box because I cared much more about these characters than I did anybody in Bird Box. I think that the acting is also better here because the actors can't do as much. They're more restricted. So there's less of an inclination to tell the story through dialogue and much more of it being like, okay, we're going to tell the story by what's happening. You have them eating dinner off of leaves because they can't make any noise with plates and spoons and that kind of thing. You have this discussion of levels of sound and how much that can cover what's happening, and that's one of the only real discussions that you have is when they're talking about how if you make other noise, you can find some level of safety, which could have, I've heard this before, it could have come into the plot more because theoretically if you needed something to cover your noise, say with a baby, there's a waterfall and a running river, and so maybe relocate somewhere closer to the river so you have the cover of the sound so you don't have to worry so much about the baby attracting attention. But what do I know? I'm not living in the apocalypse. It is a very intense and engaging movie. The design and the work on it is really good. The monster design is really good. I like the look of it. The monsters have a kind of War of the Worlds kind of look to them in terms of like how they crawl around and everything, but the look and build of them, you're gonna have to bear with me. There's lawn work happening out back. How like YouTube. You try and record and you try and record and you try and record, and as soon as you start, lawn work begins. So the monster design though is really good. It's really engaging. I do think that the monsters themselves are scary in the sense that you don't want to encounter any of them, but they are just these mindless, destructive machines. There's no rhyme or reason to what they do. They just, anytime they hear anything, they kill it. And there was something about that I found a little hollow. It didn't really necessarily resonate in the same way as other monsters where there's like a kind of deeper understanding and impulse and maybe even some kind of psychology. None of that. It's just kill. And so that was a little like, okay, and they're aliens, and so I gotta give it to you because there doesn't necessarily need to be a rhyme or reason, but even if you just saw them eating some of the people that they killed, it might make it feel less like they just kill for the sake of killing. And it really did just genuinely feel like they just kill for the sake of killing. And there's also a few moments where things happen in the plot, characters running through cornfields and that kind of thing, where it seems like a lot of noise is being made, and yet they don't attract any attention. So that was another one of those things where I was like, okay, you're a little fast and loose with these rules sometimes. Sometimes a little bit of sound attracts a lot of attention. Sometimes a medium amount of sound attracts no attention. I'm having trouble following the rules all the time, but I did like a lot of the pacing and ideas here. The idea that they've marked out where they can step in the house so they don't creak any boards. The idea that they keep very close tabs on everything. They poured down these sand roads so that they can walk and not attract attention. They all walk barefoot. Like these really great details that help build out the world and the environment and the story. You know, it had like a Hitchcock feel to it in a lot of ways of just like showing us, not telling us. So Krasinski does a great job of directing here, along with acting. He is a very good actor here, but he's a really great director here. And credit to him. Really good. Really liked A Quiet Place. Immediately rolled into A Quiet Place too. I was just like, you know what? It's 2 a.m. Who wants another horror movie? Let's do it. I didn't intend to finish it. My plan was to start it, get about halfway through, and go to bed. But I got about 30 minutes out from the finish. It's only... The combined length of both movies is 3 hours. So in the amount of time it takes you to watch one theatrical cut of Lord of the Rings, you can watch both A Quiet Place 1 and 2. So A Quiet Place Part 2 is once again directed by John Krasinski and has largely the same cast, with a few additions, most notably Cillian Murphy and Jaimin Hunsu, who has a very small role late in the movie. Cillian Murphy comes in and he's going to play the new lead dominant male because Krasinski is off doing other things. He's really great at the beginning of the movie. The beginning of the movie sets up day one of all of this nonsense beginning with the falling of the meteors and the monsters appearing, and that's where we really see kind of this impulse where the monsters more just kill. They don't really hunt, they just kill. They just kill. That's their whole thing, it's just killing. And you see the chaos of the world ending and how all, it's just coming down around them. This movie follows Emily Blunt, Millicent Simmons, Noah Jupe, and Cillian Murphy as they continue to try and navigate through this world of monsters. The team is finally forced to leave the farm. It is time to move on to the next thing. And as they do, they meet Cillian Murphy, a fellow survivor who they knew from before the fall of the universe. And he has lost everything. And he is living in an abandoned train station using a giant fucking furnace as his hiding spot, which becomes a huge part of the plot because you can only stay in the furnace for so long before you run out of air. It's airtight, it self-seals, so you gotta make sure it doesn't do that. A lot of Chekhov's guns waiting to go off with this furnace, and they all do. It is a very good follow-up to A Quiet Place Part 1. I would say it's a little bit more commercial because the monsters have a bigger role. We do less world building and more world reacting, where you see kind of the fall of the world, and then you see kind of the new world, right? Cillian Murphy talks about how this is no longer the world that we all knew, people aren't as good as you might think that they are, and maybe they're not even worth saving at this point. So he's seeing some shit. He ends up having to go with Millicent Simmons on this mission to try and find a radio signal that's out there, because they have a plan, and the plan involves sending a signal out as far as they can. And if there's a radio, then they can at least start somewhere. So the plot is very linear in terms of its direction. It's very much like Millicent Simmons has a plan. Nobody else wants to go with her. She goes on her own. Emily Blunt, being desperate, asks Cillian Murphy to go and find her and bring her home. He finds her, and instead of bringing her home, she convinces him to go along with her plan. I will say Noah Jupe has more to do in this movie than he did in the last one. He has a lot less crying to do in this movie, though he still does a fair bit of crying. But he does get to be a tough guy by the end of the movie, and I thought that he did a pretty good job. There were a few moments where I was like, no, don't do that. There weren't really that many moments like that in the first one where you were like, oh, come on, blah, blah. But in this one, there was definitely like one or two moments where both him and Emily Blunt, I was like, oh, you gotta know this is a bad idea. Like, you gotta know that this is a bad idea. They face off against their share of monsters, while our other Scooby Squad goes and finds the... It was kind of like, if anybody watched Lost out there, it was kind of like the island in Lost, where you had all of the people, like the little village that they find, where you have all the people living. You just have, at the end of the world, this group of survivors who have all moved to this island. Because I guess the monsters can't swim, although we see one swim in the first one, so again, hot and cold. I guess a little bit of water is different than a lot of water. Once again, the island comes under attack by, guess what, monsters. Because one floats over on a boat, which was a little circumstantial. I was kind of like, okay, all right, you got to get a monster on the island somehow, but don't think I don't see you, I see you. So overall, very enjoyable movie, very good movie. I like that both movies kind of end, not with a cliffhanger, but without a traditional denouement. There's just kind of this close. It's not that either feel incomplete, it's that they feel left open for more story. And I think it's done very well in both cases. I would say that I think I liked part 2 a little less than part 1, not because it's worse, but just because part 1 is more of a lightning storm caught in a bottle. Whereas this is more formulaic at times and a little bit more commercial. There's a lot more talking in this one. There's a lot more conversation between characters. But I did like it. I still liked how things went. I still liked the pacing and the plotting. I don't think that either of these movies are too long. Neither of them have any real fat on them that you're like, oh, this scene. Both of them move at a very good pace. Both of them are very engaging. And the entire time, you're just taken with what's happening. Do I wish that there were a little bit more to certain aspects of it? Sure. But overall, if we're talking about a monster movie, things can get far worse than this. Quiet Place Parts 1 and 2, I would say if we're gonna give it a full score, I would give it like a 7.75, maybe an 8 between the two of them. I think overall I would give Part 1 probably an 8 and Part 2 probably a 7. Not because it's worse, just because it doesn't quite live up to the first one. Not in a bad way by any means. It's still incredibly engaging. But I would say both are successful, good movies that are worth your time and effort. So that's going to be it for me from NerdPod Generations. My name is Alfred Judson. Once again, you can find me at judsonstudios.work under the Bronx Division tab. You can find us on Spotify, on YouTube, on Apple, all over the place. So just Google NerdPod Generations and you will find us. And until next time, have a great week, friends and enemies.